Hello everyone, my name is Kavish and welcome to Dev Summit. I am a specialist of developer products in Esri technical support, and today we are going to discuss about some essential troubleshooting workflows for ArcGIS Runtime SDK for iOS. This SDK focuses on developing mapping applications within iOS domain, and the apps can be built with this SDK that can be then deployed and used on iOS devices like iPhones and iPads. Now, before we begin with the tips and tricks, let's first see where does the troubleshooting occurs in the whole procedure while resolving any kind of issues. In short, let's study the big picture and conclude an important principle in this process. As you can see here, first we learn about an issue, and during the app's implementation, we then review the whole code workflow, how the code is working, what classes are being used, how is the calling of functions going on. Both of these, learning the issue and reviewing the workflow, forms the information part, which can then be carried forward for troubleshooting. Ultimately, after the troubleshooting, we end up with a resolution for the known issue. The principle which you will see associated with every tips and tricks which we are going to discuss ahead is that always narrow down the problem. We all develop amazing applications, but with their huge scale, it can sometimes become difficult to search the root cause of an issue. This principle will help to narrow down the problem, which ultimately becomes more easier to test. With this, let's start with our first module. And our first module in troubleshooting is the SDK, Runtime SDK itself. The question which we can ask here is, what is the SDK actually doing in our application? And if it is doing something related with the mapping, then the SDK itself becomes the main engine to run that part of the code. And so we can check if we are following proper API references, if proper classes, method, properties are being used, and the whole object-oriented programming paradigm is working or not. With the API reference, we can also check whether we are following some of the standard workflows, like loadable patterns, offline workflow, authentication, and many more such like that. The next module helps most of the times heavily to narrow down the issue and thus proving the principle which we discussed before. If let's say it is getting difficult to troubleshoot a problem through our main application, we can always create small application focusing just on the runtime SDK's workflow and then troubleshooting it. With this, it will give you a break from the main iOS application. The main advantage here is with sample application, the focus will be on the runtime SDK. So you can see whether the workflow of SDK is working or not. And you can always create your own sample applications, or the runtime SDK has provided small sample apps for essential workflows, which you can use through the SDK's GitHub repository. The next module here is debugging the network. Now, let's first see where does the networking comes into picture when we are developing iOS application using the runtime SDK. As you can see, our apps are connected with ArcGIS servers, portal for ArcGIS, or ArcGIS Online to import some of the important resources like services, etc. And as you can see in this diagram, in plain computer science terms, there is a handshake happening between our client iOS application and the server. Our app sends request to the server asking about some resources from it. Server acknowledges it and then responds. Many of the times, issues like resources not getting displayed or not getting rendered are caused because of network issues. Again, issues like failed authentication, like OAuth authentication or integrated Windows authentication, etc., also falls under this same domain. This means that the requests and responses are not occurring correctly somewhere in the network. And so, to check these requests and responses, we can always use some network debugging tools like the ones which are listed here and check whether the request and response are going correctly or not. Now, based on network debugging, we can check if the issue is occurring on the client or on the server side or on the network side. If the issue is occurring on client side, which means the issue is related purely with the SDK, then as we discussed before, we can troubleshoot the SDK itself. And if the issue is occurring from the server end, then we can focus on the server first without focusing on the SDK. Many times when we are accessing resources from the server, we can see the resources like feature services or map services or any operational services, etc., are not rendering properly, or we are not getting the results after querying upon those services, etc. If this issue is not associated with the client nor with the network, we should troubleshoot it on the REST endpoint. As you can see, right now the issue, as we discussed, is related with the server. So by troubleshooting on REST endpoint, we isolate the whole issue from our main iOS application. With REST endpoint, it focuses on services through its endpoint URL. That means you can go to the REST endpoint, select the operation which you are trying to do on your client iOS application, and then troubleshoot it. Some of the common troubleshooting operations which we can do on REST endpoint are querying the service, executing geoprocessing task, creating replica, uh, which comes under the offline workflow, and many more like this. As a result of all this troubleshooting, we have validated all the three domains, which are, we have validated the client, validated the network, and validated the REST endpoint to solve any particular issue related either in this domain. Our next module is errors. Errors are greatly beneficial while troubleshooting. If we know the error, we can quickly research on it and resolve it. To understand the origins of an error, the Runtime SDK helps with three essential information. An error can origin from the API, or the error can occur from the runtime core which supports the API, or it can occur from the services which are getting accessed in the application. Next, in order to handle these errors, we can use some practices like using return codes, using callback functions, using exceptions, and these all paradigms are discussed in the Runtime SDK documentation on how to better handle errors. The next module is the Xcode himself, the IDE which is used to create iOS application. As you can see here, there are some of important debugging tools on Xcode which can help us in understanding or resolving an issue. As you can see on the left, the debug gauges or the debug navigator can help with some performance issues when we have to see whether a particular operation is using a large amount of memory or time. Then we can evaluate it using the debug gauges. Debug bar provides control on debugging based on the breakpoints which we can add to the code. On the right hand side, the console itself can give direct information on the errors, and the source editor is a dynamic editor which can help you in working on syntactical errors and etc. Our next module is the GeoNet Community. The GeoNet Community is a strong online forum where you can get direct help from the GIS community. If you're looking for an existing issues, you can check out the community, or if there is no existing issues which you are dealing with, you can always post a new issue to get some responses. And apart from this, you can always share new ideas in order to improve the SDK. Moving on, some of the other essentials in troubleshooting a particular issue with the Runtime SDK can fall under either the SDK documentation or under SDK version. Under SDK documentation, the complete documentation can help you in learning some of the standard workflows, like loadable async patterns or accessing the ArcGIS platform and many more such that. With SDK version, you can check what new version of SDK is there and what new functionality has been added. Sometimes an issue which is occurring in some of the older versions of the SDK can be quickly resolved if it has been addressed in the newer version of SDK. One of the advantage of using the latest version of SDK is that we can have bug fixed on some of the issues, or we can find some of the new enhancement being addressed. And at last, you can always reach out to us at Esri Technical Support. Here, we will help you in troubleshooting by doing screen sharing sessions and following some of the guidelines of troubleshooting, which we discussed before. We can help you in logging bugs and enhancement. And more than this, both you and us can form a collaboration in understanding what is happening in the SDK and then moving ahead in resolving a particular issue. And these are some of the useful URLs which we have discussed earlier in some of the tips and tricks of troubleshooting. Thank you so much.